Hello, everybody. Welcome, everybody. We begin by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 6 lands and the traditional lands of the Métis, Dakota, Lakota, and Saulteaux, and honor and respect each other and affirm and reaffirm our relationship to one another. My name's Lenore Swiston. I'm the host of Civically Speaking, and I'm here with my colleagues today and friends from Voice of Saskatoon, Anika Mishka, Rashid Ahmad, and Majora Ghosh. So thanks, guys. Thanks for coming on the show with me today. We're here to talk about something pretty important, and we've got our behind-the-scenes team from No Saskatoon, Deborah Hobach and Ian Roche, who's with us in the studio tonight. And just to share that Civically Speaking runs on CFCR on Tuesdays at 6:30, 90.5 FM. And Voice of Saskatoon, you guys are notorious for doing a lot of different shows all over using Facebook as your main feed. And I just want to thank you for that. Today's topic, it's close to my heart. I am a Ukrainian Canadian, or Canadian Ukrainian, as they say. And, you know, when this hit home pretty hard. My mom says, you know, it touches her heart pretty close because she says, you know, it doesn't take much to imagine herself having to walk down a road with a suitcase in hand, wondering where you're going. We have family that's over there and connections over there. And so we feel that this is important because it touches the hearts of many here at home as well. There are several leaders from around the world that are calling this a genocide, as well as a lot of other things. And we're going to get into that discussion today about what the impacts of this, what's going on in Ukraine in terms of an invasion and how it's being felt around the world. And so with that, I want to hand it over to Anika, that's going to introduce our panel guests for today. So Anika, over to you.
Thanks, Lenore. So we would now like to welcome our panel members. First, we have Diane Boyko, a well-known community leader who wears many hats in our community. Thanks, Diane, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Perfect. We have Dr. Bohdan Kordan, a political scientist, professor emeritus with St. Thomas More College with the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you so much, Bohdan, for joining us tonight.
Pleased to be here.
Perfect. We have Keith Willoughby, Dean of Edward School of Business, joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Keith, for taking the time and joining us.
Good evening, everyone.
Perfect. And last but certainly not least, we have Christina Chernesky, a communications strategist. Thank you so much, Christina, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Perfect. So thank you again for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to be with us here tonight. So this forum will be conducted in 4 main parts. The first, we will begin with a quick round of introduction by the panel members. Second, we have a couple of questions we would like to ask each panel members to lead this panel session off. And third, and most importantly, we will open the floor to you as viewing members who joined us either through Facebook or by joining the Twitter conversation using the hashtag #SaskUkraine. Everyone will be required to have a Facebook ID in order to ask questions. Around 8:15, we will close our discussion and give our panel members a minute or two to share any closing reflections or guidance going forward. Our role as a host will be to keep the flow of conversation going and queue up and ask the questions to our panel members. Thank you so much again for joining us tonight. Again, any questions you have for our panel members, make sure to drop it down below and we'll be more than happy to answer as many questions as we can. And I'll pass it on to you, Lenore.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Diane, you're going to start us off tonight by just, begin by tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. And then, what's top of mind for you right now with respect to the events happening in Ukraine? Really want to know, because we know you're part of this community. It's deep into your heart. So a little bit about yourself and, what's top of mind for you right now with this?
Well, thank you, Lenore. So as you mentioned, I'm a Ukrainian Canadian or Canadian Ukrainian. My ancestry my ancestors came here to Saskatchewan and to Alvina, Saskatchewan, specifically in 1901. So I'm at 4th generation of Ukrainian that has it's been part of my whole life. So when you grow up in a small community, it's 95% Ukrainian, the language is there, the religion is there, the culture is there. So it's been a very big part of my life. I have two daughters that have also been very engaged in the Ukrainian community here in Saskatoon. They grew up at St. Goretti, where the Ukrainian bilingual program was, and now it extends to Bishop Filavich Ukrainian bilingual program, and we're part of St. George's Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral, and so we were immersed in it, and that the community, the small community that we had where I grew up, it just transported itself here to Saskatoon, and so. We are a big part of who we are has been in regards to being a part of this Ukrainian community. And so I think when February 24th came along, those of us that have been paying attention to what has gone on since Crimea, I don't want to say it was expected, because the magnitude I don't think was, but some of us weren't really that surprised because of what had been going on in the past. And so from a community that very much was focused on, at least in my case, in sort of the cultural aspect and the religious aspect, the nationalistic aspect has been, I think, what's really grown inside my heart now and within the community that I belong to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. Moving on to, Dr. Willoughby. Keith, from your perspective, share with us, first of all, a little bit about your background. And then, from your perspective, what's top of mind for you when we think about this?
Well, thank you, Lenore. A pleasure to be on the show this evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I am currently the Dean of the Edwards School of Business at the University of Saskatchewan, and a professor in the Department of Finance and Management Science with specific academic research and teaching expertise in the area of operations management or supply chain management. So what's especially top of mind for me right now as I look at the recent events in the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and maybe even more broadly than that, in terms of looking at the impact of the pandemic, the impact of other episodes we've had across the globe. I'm interested in looking at the impact that this will have on the global citizens from a supply chain point of view, from a consumer point of view. We've definitely recognized that as a global society, we are incredibly interconnected, whether it's through culture, as Diane so eloquently mentioned, whether it's through the economics of supply chains, as we've seen over the past 2 years especially. The impacts in Russia and the Ukraine have a tremendous impact on commodities, on supplies, and definitely an impact that all of us are seeing even here in Canada. So from that perspective, I'm really keenly interested in terms of how these events will impact the globe economy from an economic perspective, and what we can do as citizens to try to help create advocacy for those in Ukraine who are suffering. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we're going to dig deeper into that, so I really appreciate the introduction from those of you so far. Over to you, Dr. Cordon. I mean, this is something that's not just close to your heart from a cultural perspective, but a lived perspective, but also from a study. So share a bit more about your background and what's top of mind for you these days.
Sure. I'm a professor of political studies at the University of Saskatchewan, St. Thomas More College. Been teaching at the U.S. for 30 years, and prior to that at the University of Alberta and MacEwan University. I held academic and research positions there. But before that, I was also studying in the United States and elsewhere in Canada doing graduate work. So generally speaking, this has been a long time interest for me, largely because in political studies, I've worked in the area of international conflict and diplomacy. So I have a fascination with and interest in sort of international conflict and the resolution of conflict. And this has spilled into other areas, not least of which is ethnic conflict. And by definition, this issue of human rights and the protection of minorities and so on and so forth. So I also have a personal connection to much of this. Part of it is my folks came in the immediate post-Second World War period, so I was born here in Canada, Toronto born, but their life stories had quite an impact on my life, and it really was quite. It pulled me in a certain direction. So my interest in politics, but my interest also in politics from a particular political perspective. So I'll full disclosure here, I'm a social democrat. So I'm very much concerned about what's going on currently in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Cordon. And for anyone interested, some of the books that you have are phenomenal. So we'll be sure to get a link up to some of the writings that you have been doing on this. So much appreciation there. Christina Chernesky, over to you. And, you know, in full disclosure, we've been doing a whole bunch of parts on civically speaking in terms of keeping people up on just the most recent current events around this issue. And so, Christina, for you, tell us a little bit more about your background and what's top of mind for you today.
Thank you, Lenore, and thank you so much to the entire panel for inviting me and my colleagues and friends into this group. I really appreciate it. I'm Christina Chernesky. I'm also a Saskatoon-born Ukrainian Canadian, and my great-grandparents came to Canada in 1905 when Saskatchewan was just becoming Saskatchewan. They got some land from the Canadian government not far from Melville, Saskatchewan, in a small town named Goodeve. And we still own that land, and we have much more than was initially given to my great-grandparents, John and Maria Chernesky. This is a very near and dear issue because of my upbringing as well. Diane and I have had similar lives growing up in Saskatoon. And we were raised as Ukrainian Canadians. We were taught Ukrainian first. We couldn't speak English until we were about 6, my sisters and I. And we grew up appreciating the fact that we were Ukrainian. As a result, that's been embedded into our hearts and our souls. And of course, now it's uppermost in our minds. As we mark today, the 50th day of struggle in Ukraine, I'm dismayed to say that we're still trying to figure this thing out. This invasion in Ukraine. Although at the same time, we completely, as Ukrainian Canadians and as Ukrainians, we do inherently understand why it's happening, but it's frustrating to watch. It's dismaying to see so many people losing their lives. It's heartening to see Ukrainians worldwide unite and join together and mark the big events and the small tragedies and the large tragedies. We're on the brink of losing some cities in Ukraine, and we're all watching closely and praying that we can emerge as Ukraine. We can emerge through this conflict with some success. But then how do you define success? I'm honored to be here, as I mentioned earlier, because I do have a voice, and we'll all be able to share our voices, and hopefully we'll cross some similar paths as we try to figure out how we'll move forward. Again, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be part of this.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for the introductions and kind of giving us a bit of an overview in terms of what are some of those top of mind issues, you know, from your various perspectives. Anika, over to you for kind of our next round.
Perfect. So now we have a couple questions for our panel members. The first one being, people continue to ask, why is this invasion happening? Please, drawing from your perspective, experience, and research, what do you think prompted this invasion and the implications of this in our economy? I will start with Dr. Cordon.
There are a lot of theories about why the invasion, why the conflict, and why now. And I think that we can sort of explain it variously. We can attribute to the actions of one particular person, Mr. Putin, and the argument, of course, is that this is Mr. Putin's war. And yet at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the fact that some 83% of the Russian population support Mr. Putin in his actions in Ukraine. They see this as a justifiable conflict. And then we have to understand, well, how is it justified? And the argument and the narrative that is used, even though that it is a fairly contained narrative, it's about so-called denazification of Ukraine. This, of course, is a canard. Everyone knows that, and you've heard it repeated, so I won't go over the basic elements, but that there are no Nazis in Ukraine. There are no Nazis in government and the like. Denazification speaks more largely to this question of the attempt to restore Russian sort of influence over Ukraine, which necessarily means to introduce within Ukraine a governance system that is friendly to Russia, but more importantly, that does not contain any of those elements that that Russia sees as a threat to its own sort of political existence as a current day structure based on notions of Russia's place in the world and in terms of its relationship with in Eastern Europe and with Ukraine specifically. So denazification is really about anyone or the government itself in Ukraine being essentially anti-Russian. So it's really about stamping out anti-Russianism, and yet there's no evidence of that in Ukraine. And so we're at a miss to understand what is the basis of this. And so part of it has to be framed in a larger historical sort of context. What is the narrative of Russia's relationship to Ukraine? And it is largely a relationship between empire and colony. And it's really the restoration of imperial rule over Ukraine. And you see this being sort of played out in various statements that come out of the Kremlin. Most notoriously, in a July 2021 statement released, an essay produced by the Kremlin was released about the unity of Ukraine and Russia, and then more recently, a number of statements that could only have been sanctioned by the Office of the President in the Kremlin, which is in effect the destruction of Ukraine as an independent entity. And it really speaks to some really troubling aspects of the conflict, the genocidal nature of the conflict. And I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your insight. I'll go to Keith Willoughby.
Thank you, Nika. I would concur with Bohdan in terms of this being the actions of a certain individual trying perhaps to dial back the clock, so to speak, to restore previous situations and circumstances. I think, to me, what I really see in terms of an impact is, besides human suffering that we see, what concerns me is the livelihood of people in Ukraine who are being impacted. Ukraine is by no means a small player in the global economy, in agricultural industries, for example. And the challenge that I really see emanating from all of this is another episode in a 2-year plus situation of supply chain disruptions that really could impact us across the globe. Whether we see the pandemic beginning of March of 2020, think back to experiences in Western Canada last year with climate change and weather challenges that disrupted supply chains, even a Suez Canal blockage, which impacted us throughout the world. This is another element now in a furtherance of supply chain challenges, because the Ukraine, given its location, as well as given its impact on global economies, it's a challenge for the rest of the world in terms of access to products. It's also a challenge for the people in Ukraine with their livelihoods being threatened as well as their lives. And that concerns me as a management professor.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Keith. I'll go to Christina.
And it's not just what's happening now. And thank you very much, Keith and Bohdan, for those perspectives. But if you look historically at the dynamic between Ukrainians and Russians, and I mean, this goes back a century plus, even longer, it's constantly been there. That conflict has always been there. Look at the events that have occurred in Ukraine, from the 1920s to the forced famine, where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians literally starved to death. There are so many events in Ukrainian history where the Russian government has tried to, flatten the population of Ukraine, and yet the country continues to emerge. I don't think Putin fully understands, and I've said this on the Norse program many times, maybe I do, maybe I don't, but I don't know if Putin fully understands how many Ukrainians left Ukraine and then set up their communities in different countries only to keep the unification with Ukraine from a distance. We've never really lost our roots despite where we live. And we're so strong worldwide. Putin can't just simply obliterate the nation of Ukraine, but yet the fighting continues. And and it's happening right now. But this time, it feels as though Ukrainians are standing up and fighting back. Look what happened with the Russian warship Moskva today or last night, that it was sort of blown out of the water, and other major events that keep Ukrainians, feeling a little bit positive about what's happening here. But this goes back so deep that there are folk songs written about it. There are dances that are performed because of the conflict between Ukrainians and Russians. The fact that we can speak Ukrainian in Canada is because of our ancestors who refused to let that language go. And Ukraine is Ukraine because we're Ukrainian. I think Diane can explain it as well too, but I really think that Putin is taking a stab at it and saying, okay, it's my turn to see if we can wipe out Ukraine. But we sit here and we say, I don't think it's going to happen. We're going to continue to fight.
Thank you so much, Christina. Yeah, on to you, Dan.
Yeah, and I would, continue along that vein, that this has been a destruction of a culture in Putin's mind, a destruction of a people. You almost get the impression that he feels that somehow all of us as Ukrainians are subhuman in some capacity. And I think, it really disturbs all of us across the world that he feels this way. And I think, Christina, you spoke to all of that, even just the comparison of who we are as a Ukrainian people and Russians as Slavs, I guess I will say it, that if there's that kind of parallel, they've never believed that we should be who we are as a separate people. And the narrative that keeps happening all the time, that we know that Kiev was established in 1000, and 500 years later that Moscow was brought into being. And there's constantly this rearranging of history and the conversation of things like language. And I think Christina mentioned the diaspora and how we've strongly kept being Ukrainian all across the world. And I heard an interesting comment once that said the true Ukrainian language is almost in the diaspora, because so many of our when our ancestors left at various times, there was that we were taking, the ones from 1901, it may have been sort of the peasant people that were coming that are my ancestry, but they brought the language, the true language that they spoke. And there wasn't that, the mixture, I guess, of languages and I don't know what I say, the bastardization of the language maybe in itself, and maybe that is what has been occurring, and is part of it now. But there's been that resurgence of language, and I think they look to the diaspora as well from those people in Ukraine. I remember talking to one of my friends, Irena Matsuk, who's been here in Saskatoon for a while, and I remember her saying she never felt so Ukrainian until she moved to Saskatoon when she came from Ukraine. And I think that that's a strength that we have, and that rallying call across the world is such a passionate call for all of us. And I think that also gives strength to people who are fighting for us in Ukraine, that they know that we're all behind them in maybe the most important part is the spirit of this all.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Diane, and much appreciation for this very insightful responses. I'll pass it back to Lenore. You're muted, Lenore.
There you go. The infamous mute. Thanks so much. We're going to go to some international efforts here, and then we're going to come back to some economic considerations. I'll toss that back to Anika as well a little bit. And, there's a number of international efforts underway, from sanctions, militarily, humanitarian. So based on your kind of perspectives, your experiences, your research, where applicable, what are some things you would like the listeners to understand about the international efforts underway right now with respect to the Russian invasion going on in Ukraine? Not a big question at all, of course. But, and let's try to unpack this, and feel free to jump in on the conversation too. As things are coming up by your colleagues on that, we'll start off kind of, Keith, with you as Dean of the School of Edwards Business, the international aspect of this. I know that you're talking about supply chains and that. What are some of the things that we need to really understand here in terms of the implication it has for us?
Well, excellent question. It's challenging to unpack it because it is so weighty in and of itself. But the one thing I think I would really want listeners and viewers to understand is inherently supply chains are resilient. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and say that it's all going to be good tomorrow afternoon. But supply chains inherently have some resilience. Now, they've been challenged over the past few years with many events that have really challenged them in a variety of instances. So I'd say from a supply chain perspective, we can get through this. In terms of sanctions and what that would hold, I really hope and I really trust that can help really create a sea change in terms of the situations occurring between Ukraine and Russia right now. Economic sanctions are objectively, we look at them and we know that there's an importance there because it impacts countries financially and economically. I would hope that as we go through this, and what I would want, I think, the listeners to understand is that the sanctions can work as long as I think we as consumers around the world recognize that there may be a bit of turbulence once this happens, because we're so interconnected across the globe with respect to supply chains and product flows. It's our way, I think, of contributing and helping to affect a cause. We may have to endure some turbulence here, but I think the greater good in the end will outshine and outweigh some temporary disadvantages we may have to face here in this country.
Yeah, thank you for that, Keith. Much appreciated. And I know we're going to go even deeper into that. So I know there's a lot of follow-up questions I think that some of my colleagues here have already. But Christina, weighing in on this, for those that are just tuning in, thank you. Follow along in the comment section on Facebook. If you're on Twitter, go ahead to Sask Ukraine, hashtag Sask Ukraine. Ask a question if you like there as well. Christina, what do we need the listeners to understand? I mean, there's the sanctions, as we heard from Keith. We're talking militarily and also humanitarian. So what's coming to mind for you that we need to be thinking about here?
Well, it's difficult to talk about the sanctions because initially, when all of this started 50 days ago, you heard a lot of politicians and just a lot of people who were chipping in on the conversation to say, cut off Russia, cut off their cable, cut off their internet. Don't purchase anything from Russia. And I understand that these are just sort of the things on the surface of what punitive measures can be taken against Russia. But quite frankly, I don't think they care. I honestly don't believe that what's happening in Russia is having a profound impact on the citizens of Russia. There just seems to be so much deliberate misunderstanding, if you will, from even the people who live in Russia, or just the sheer fact that they don't really fully understand what's going on. So when I'll leave it to the experts to really delve deeper into how sanctions can have an impact. But quite frankly, just as a Ukrainian Canadian, again, I would just love to see Russia cut off from everything, and so there. But that's the punitive side in me, and I do know that a lot of my other friends and even colleagues talk about this, and they feel the same way. That there has to be a way to punish the Russian government or punish Russia harder, and it feels like nothing is happening. But at the same time, inherently, I know things are happening. And I know that it is being felt inside of Russia. I have some Russian friends whom I communicate with on different various levels, and they are feeling this. But again, I'll leave it to the experts to talk about how these sanctions should take place. But I wish that they were being felt faster and sooner.
Let me do a follow-up with you, though, Christina, like from a humanitarian perspective, when we think about the international efforts, what are some thoughts you have there about what's going on?
In terms of how different countries are coming to the aid of Ukraine?
Yeah,
Lenore?
yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, definitely it's heartening to see countries, rise up and say, we are not going to tolerate this. Justin Trudeau spoke out almost immediately when this first started. But even Joe Biden, the president of the United States, just a day or so ago, calling what's happening in Ukraine a genocide, which of course prompted a lot of discussion as to what's genocide and what's not a genocide. And yet the word genocide has been bandied about quite frequently over these last few weeks. But when Joe Biden said it, suddenly there was discussion about whether or not what's happening in Ukraine is genocide. So, I mean, who do we leave this up to decide? Is it NATO? Is it other, world groups that have an opinion on these things and actually have some oomph on these things? Or does it take world leaders to step off the script like Biden did the other day and say these words? Granted, Justin Trudeau has called this a genocide as well, but these are countries that should be a bit more vocal in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. And I think the time of being afraid of Putin might have to start to wind down here a little bit, because otherwise this probably will extend further and further.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, Diane, pick up on that, please.
Yeah, and Lenore, Christine, I appreciate it. And then what worries me is the election that's happening in France. And you hear, the comments that Le Pen, I believe her name is, that she's making that supports Russia. So is that worries me when there is the narrative that's out there where we're having all of these people finally stepping up with the Prime Minister and the President. We see that what Boris Johnson is doing as well. And then you have, you would think that that's an anomaly, and yet at the same time, it really worries me, because what happens during that election is going to be very telling indeed. So many of our friends here, I know when I go and help support the Stream of Hopes, and we're doing packaging of humanitarian aid, and I'm listening to some of the people that have been here for 4 or 5 years that are phoning back to their families in Russia, and they won't believe a word of what's going on. They believe that this is a justified war, if you will, but they're not believing the atrocities that are happening. And I think that's what worries all of us here when we see it blatantly. And we're watching what's happening, and I almost equate this to, I'm going to put it in sort of in my context of schoolyard fight, and we have Putin and Zelensky, and the rest of the world is standing behind with their cameras saying stop doing this, but still taking the pictures. And and I worry, what is that line that everybody talks about? We're all anxious for it to have already been crossed, and we believe it has been so many numerous times, but what is it going to take? How many more deaths? How many more Buchas and Mariupols is it going to take? And that frustration, that all of us feel. And to your point too, Christina, we know that as in my case, as an elected person, I know that sometimes the public knows 10% of what's going on, and that's all that is allowed in the circumstances. And that I really have to believe, and I pray that 90% that I don't know that's happening, that the world doesn't know is happening, is the allies, if I can say that, building everything that they need to build to be able to stop this. And you just wonder if it's like, let's be damned, we're going to do what we need to do to stop this man, and the consequences be damned at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, for that. Bogdan, pick up on this.
Yeah, I'd like to just interject on. I think that there's a lot of anxious sort of talk here about what might happen, what's occurring in France and the rest of it. Is there some backsliding going on? I think we need to sort of draw back from this and look at it from a distance and understand where was Ukraine, let us even say 2 months ago, and where it is currently in terms of its relationship with Europe in particular, but also the United States and Canada and the like. And I think that you need to read at the outset of the conflict, or before the conflict, there was a certain ambivalence about Ukraine, and it was always about Ukraine being sort of placed in a position where it had to negotiate with Russia, and on this was generally meant to be what would Ukraine be willing to concede territorially, but you'll even recall some of the statements even made by Biden, which is at the initial incursions, well, as long as it's not a deep incursion, it was only a minor incursion. We tend to forget these things. But currently, you're seeing this kind of ramping up of armaments to Ukraine, like really serious heavy weaponry and sophisticated weaponry. These are the kinds of things that, let us say, during the Donbas War, which has been raging since 2015, was not available to Ukraine. And the preparation wasn't available, not to antagonize Russia. We are at a point, or a junction, because of the invasion, but more importantly, because of what the invasion stands for, as we begin to see the kind of reimagination of Ukraine and Ukraine's place in Europe. And it really speaks to how Mr. Putin really doesn't understand both Europe, the West, and Ukraine. And more specifically, Ukraine's place within the European family. To be, as is often heard on the streets in Kiev, but elsewhere, which is to be European is to be in Kiev. It's not to be in Berlin or Paris or Madrid or Lisbon. To be European, to know what it means to be European, is to be in Ukraine. That to me is like a significant, and the Ukrainians have been repeating this time and again, which is, in fact, we are European. This is our desired trajectory. This is who we are. And they reject the alternative. They reject what has happened because they've seen what's happened in Donbas and Crimea, thuggery, the kind of blatant sort of authoritarianism that denies people their basic human rights, their basic sort of reason to be. And in this regard, it isn't even around questions of language, which is often because in those ethno-nationalist terms that Mr. and other sort of Russian chauvinists would have us believe. The majority of Eastern Ukrainians are Russian speaking. It's not about language. It is about dignity. It's about the freedom to choose. And this necessarily places Ukrainians within that kind of sort of psychological mindset, and why this is going to be very difficult to defeat. They may be able to defeat them on the battlefield, and this is a tactical issue. They probably won't be able to swallow all of Ukraine, which is even going to be more problematic for Russia. But even those occupied territories, there is currently in Khersonshchina, there is partisan warfare that's going on. And they won't be able to control it or hold on to the territory. And it'll probably result in the brutalization of the population. No doubt that'll be all, but all it will do is galvanize sort of the population. And my sense will be is that this will be initially a war of attrition, but in the end it'll be a retreat, much as most imperial powers are forced to do over time. And so I'm very optimistic. I'm truly optimistic. There will be much suffering, tremendous suffering, and especially if Russia is backed into a corner and begins to contemplate the use of chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, which is always a distinct possibility. This is part of the intelligence community as saying that this is a distinct possibility. This could be awful. But having said that, I also know that the psychological aspect of it tells me that we've moved on beyond just sort of strategy and tactics. It really is about dignity. It's about Ukraine's place in the world. If I could just add one last comment.
Please.
Going back to this issue of sanctions, let's remember here that sanctions are really imposed on the people who actually have wealth, and the wealth is stolen for the most part, the oligarchs and the like. And only recently has it trickled down to a so-called middle class, of which it's only, maybe about 15% of the Russian population. The Russian population exists mostly at the poverty line. Almost 80% of the population lives at the poverty line throughout in rural Russia and so on and so forth. If you go outside 50 kilometers outside of Moscow, it is third world conditions. And I think more importantly is, you see some statistics, Russia, 26% of the population does not have indoor plumbing. So when you're talking about international sanctions and how it affects sort of the mindset of the average Russian, I'm not sure that they would even notice that anything has really changed in their life. So this is really about impacting the core sort of political class within Russia itself, and they may be affected, but because of the nature of their acquisition of this wealth, based on corruption and and corruption and seizure of the Russian treasury, if you will, expropriation of property and the like. They have no choice but to continue on with Mr. Putin, because if this falls apart for them, they will in effect become targets of their own citizenry that will want justice. That's why the sanctions, damn the sanctions. They have no choice. They continue to do what they have to do.
There is so much that you shared there. I hope that people that are tuning into this share this deep, share this far, and use it as a tool. Because Dr. Cordon, that was an amazing kind of gift that you just gave us in terms of providing context and background and some deeper understanding as to what the interplay of this is, not just for the people of Ukraine, but of Russia and beyond. And so thank you so much for that. I know we're going to keep building on this, but I'm going to hand this back to my colleague Anika, because I know she's got a follow-up question to an earlier one, and we'll go through that. And then I know Rashid and Madhurja also have some questions as well before we kind of go to a closing round. So we've got a ways to go yet. So much appreciation and love that you guys are diving in. So please do.
Perfect. Thanks, Lenore. So I will now ask a question from our audience. And if there is any other questions you want to ask our panel members, please feel free to drop it in the comments down below, and we'll do our best to address that question. So one of our listeners asked a couple questions. So the listener is Christia. So she asked that, how important is the Ukrainian diaspora to Ukraine now? And will the diaspora be key success factor in helping to win the war? So I will start with Christina Chernesky.
Wow, that's a great question. Thanks, Christu, for sending that in. It's difficult for me to answer that question because it feels so broad. I mean, I know that the diaspora is a critical part of the Ukrainian heritage. And it's here in Canada, it feels as though it's part of our lives. But in winning the war, I think if the diaspora plays any role, it plays in keeping us united or uniting us worldwide. It's just almost like a reminder. And I think Diane can speak even better to that right now. Diane Boyko can. About that. She was mentioning it earlier, and I was intrigued as to her direction on that. And maybe I'm just going to toss it to Diane and then listen to some of the responses as well.
Yeah, thanks, Christina, and thanks, Christia, for the question. I think, the importance of the diaspora is important for Ukraine, and it's important for the diaspora. It's that, we have that desire to belong and to understand that we are Ukrainians. Does that mean dance? Does that mean language? Does that mean religion? What does that mean? And everyone takes their own piece, I think, of being Ukrainian and what that means to them. And I think that's a really important piece right now, because what it's done is it's mobilized, I think, the whole world. And if you aren't Ukrainian, you want to be. I've heard that many times before. And I think that the diaspora is also, and I think in our own circumstances here in Canada, with the strength of the Ukrainian diaspora across Canada, it has also enabled, I guess, or put forward for our government to really take a strong stand because of the various people that are engaged in the various parts of, the sort of the political world, if I can say that, from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress to Chrystia Freeland, our Deputy Premier. And I think that strength is also what gives Canada strength, the strength of our diaspora. And I would venture to say that is also happening in other countries. I think that whole, the whole piece of the humanitarian aid has been a huge piece here in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan, and the connection that people are making from their various capacities. And there may be not people that can have the kind of conversation that Keith and Bogdan can bring to this table, but they feel something, and they know within their own spheres of influence that they can take that feeling and that desire and that connection and do something with it. And we've seen that in all of the humanitarian aid events that are going on here in Saskatoon. The Streams of Hope that are sending aid. The next week, I think it's on, or in 2 weeks, on the 4th, the city of Saskatoon, by virtue of their sister city in Chetnivtsi, is doing a wonderful luncheon that's going to be sending that humanitarian aid to Chetnivtsi, to the the Ukrainian dance groups, the people who are packaging sunflower seeds to be able to encourage people to donate to the Ukrainian bilingual school, Bishop Filavich, who is doing so much. And for me, in my sphere, the Greater Saskatoon Catholic Schools, and I know there are other divisions right across the province where students are engaged and they know what's happening in the world and they want to help in the best way they possibly can. So is it prayers at church? Is it rallies that we have? And people want to belong in that. The human condition that they're seeing happening in Ukraine, they are relating to it in the best way that they possibly can. And that is to care for one another, to send their love in any capacity that they can. And I think that's manifesting itself all throughout the world. And that is going to be the greatest strength that we can give our people in Ukraine, is to know that somebody cares, and that's the whole world cares.
And if I could just jump in here, it is, and that's what I was reaching for initially when the question was dropped, is that unification, that feeling that we get worldwide. And it's brought much closer because of social media, obviously. In fact, there's many times that I think back to previous conflicts between Ukraine and Russia when there wasn't social media, and the only way of communicating, took months, for anything to be learned in different countries. But yet now we're united, and it is that unification, and it ties together Ukrainians. Not just throughout the world, but there are different groups of Ukrainians in communities worldwide. For example, there's the religious aspect, the Catholic, the Orthodox Ukrainians. Everybody seems to be working together. There are, different classes and different groups and organizations, all of whom seem to be working together. And that feels like that uniting of Ukrainians, which is such a critical thing, which I also believe astounds many Russians in Russia, if they're hearing about it, or outside of Russia, that they are seeing this sort of these knit communities that are working together to support. So when that question comes up about diaspora and how important is it? Well, the answer is it's critical. I mean, and it's showing. The Unite for Ukraine event, which is coming up on May 4th in Saskatoon, is just one of the big steps that's occurring as people continue to work together after 2 months of this, still together to fight and to work and to stand with Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Christina and Diane. Now I'll pass it on to Keith and then followed by Bohdan.
Thanks, Anika. Yeah, and I share the sentiments that both Christina and Diane raised, and I agree. I think to answer to Christina's really astute question, yes, that is a key success factor. I think when I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a global political science expert, but to me, I can't define it, but there's something palpable going on in terms of cultural connectivity with people around the world who are on the side of Ukraine as we work through a society through this armed conflict, through this war. And to me, I think that will be tremendously successful. The other point I would make in terms of how the diaspora could be a key success factor. I'm of an age where I've never lived through a world war, but in speaking to parents and grandparents who did, there was always this question that if we would have lived in a time when there was an atrocity happening, we would have stood up and made sure that things were rectified. We would have made our voice be heard and sound. Well, now, if, ladies and gentlemen, there is an atrocity happening today in 2022. So to me, it's our chance as a global society of citizens to stand up and stand out and not simply let this pass by, because it is impacting all of us. Obviously from an economic perspective, but more from a cultural point of view, we all feel tremendous connectivity. I hearken back to Diane's astute observation that we're all Ukrainian now, and to me that's real and it's tangible, and that's where I think this is our chance in society to really show who we are and what we mean in terms of standing up and standing out.
Perfect. Over to you, Bodan.
Yeah, I'd like to make these connections. I think everyone has made some excellent points here, but I'd like to draw some of this together, maybe in a way that is recognizable by a lot of our listeners. And the first is, of course, that there is this cultural connection. And the cultural connection in the Ukrainian diaspora, there's 1.3 million individuals. Not everyone is connected to Ukraine in the same way. Most people are 5 generations removed that sort of self-identify as of Ukrainian origin. So the people who have that cultural connectivity are the people who are least removed historically from that point of settlement, if you will. But there's something much more profound going on here. Is even those people who are 5 generations removed, they see this through the particular kind of telescope, which is the telescope of their own family histories, of settling in Canada and desiring a certain kind of life for themselves and for their children, and they've witnessed this in their families. And it really is about the importance of being free, having dignity, being respected, and being acknowledged as a person of worth, if you will. And we begin to see how this sort of has this kind of, it transmutates. It actually moves beyond the personal and the specific. It actually has even a larger kind of international implications. Some of you have spoken about this idea of we are all Ukrainian now, and part of it has to do with and how Canada has really amped up its support, but it's always amped up its support because Canada's foreign policy has always been values-based. It is about such things as justice, tolerance, pluralism, freedom, and all of the kinds of things that we recognize as the foundation of what it means to be Canadian, if you will. It's shared with all liberal democratic societies, but these are the things that Ukrainians are aspiring for. And so their fight is our fight. Their struggle is our struggle. And we see this both in terms of our family histories, we see it in terms of our national culture, and we also see it in a larger international geopolitical terms. In fact, Keith's comment, which is in effect, which is this, this is a important event globally, internationally. They will be speaking about this for years to come because the nature of the threat is really about the basic sort of integrity of people at threat, nations at threat, where in effect a country can go in and overturn a political order, the international system, basically saying that we will violate the territorial integrity of a state and we will dictate to them about how they should live or will live. These are the fundamental ideas that are central to even our own political existence and our human existence. Everybody recognizes this. That's why it's so objectionable. I'd say the last point on this, which I found, was a number of individuals who've gone over as volunteers to fight in Ukraine, and they've gone elsewhere in Iraq, or they were part of the services, whether it's Americans, and they would say that those conflicts were always, there was an element of moral ambiguity, ambivalence about why we were here and what we were doing. In this case, I've heard this so many times from individuals who have joined the conflict, and they basically said, there is no moral ambivalence. We know why we're here and what needs to be done. This to me is really amazing, but it speaks to larger questions, but also personal issues, people who feel this intimately. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for all the comments, and thank you, Bodan, for kind of like bringing it all together and nicely. I will pass it on to Rashid now. Rashid, over to you.
Thank you, Anika. Very informative conversation, and it's good to know like how the world is united, and like helping all the communities which are coming to Saskatoon or in Canada from Ukraine. There is a comment from Peter Kingsmill regarding over today's conversation, saying like all the good stuff like biodiversity conservation, fair business practices, and climate management and correction simply cannot happen in a life where politics is dominated by autocratic governments and social disruptions such as we see in Ukraine, of course, but even in North America and Europe where populism is taking hold. The democratic world cannot let Ukraine lose Russia's war of choice. With that being said, Russia invasion of Ukraine, we have a question in regards to that, like who else do we need to be worried about geopolitically, economically, as this continues on? And I will start the conversation with Dr. Keith.
Thank you, Rashid. Great question. Don't know if I could actually answer who might be a specific country. Would be probably outside my expertise. But the one thing I could say in terms of maybe a concern for us as a society going forward is to recognize we've really seen the dramatic interconnectivity of all we do as a global society. So gone are the days that we are living in isolation. I think people need to recognize, especially in this nation, that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, this isn't a television show or a movie or a video game. This is reality. And there will be a ripple effect across the globe, and we will have impacts here. Obviously, humanitarian impacts, emotional impacts, cultural impacts, societal impacts, economic impacts. So, do I think this is the end of conflict? No, I think sadly, it's has the one individual mentioned in the question, when you have these autocratic governments that are dominating the world landscape, we're going to see these things occur. Where I see going forward is let's recognize as society that we can't live totally independent of these world global events, that what happens on one part of the globe will impact us here. So let's have that expectation going in terms of how we can deal with our expectations, but also our humanitarian goodwill towards others who might be suffering. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Keith, for your thoughts. Dr. Bodan, like, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would. Just very briefly, we here in the West are governed by certain principles and values that is often associated with sort of the liberal tradition, if you will, for all of its faults and warts, of which there are many. And we see this all around us. The alternative is not the shortcomings or the failings of liberalism. The alternative is illiberalism, and there are actors around the globe that are looking closely at this conflict and sort of asking the question whether, in effect, a liberal sort of the liberal tradition is up to the challenge of illiberalism. So you see this in the context of European politics, right-wing sort of political activity and the rest, but there are other sort of autocratic states, whether it's China, some of the other sort of usual suspects within global politics. They're actually looking to see whether, in effect, how this is going to resolve. If it doesn't resolve favorably, where the West is able to defend itself, then it becomes an open ticket for other sort of nefarious activity. I fear for Taiwan. I fear for places in the Middle East. I fear for other parts of the globe in Africa where it's ripe for illiberal politics to take hold, and we need to understand why this is so important. For we can reframe this as most sort of people on the on a certain part of the spectrum of the left, who often see this as a sort of NATO expansionism and so on and so forth. That's a particular narrative, but the alternative also has to be quite clear. What we're dealing with here is nothing short of Russian fascism, in my opinion. And part of it has to do is what is the response of democracy to a real and existential threat, to how we understand and what has given us a liberal peace for the last 30 longer, since 1945, and whether in effect we're prepared to abandon. I think that's how we explain this kind of recognition in the 11th hour in Europe, which is this is our fight, but it largely has to do with the kind of atrophy that comes from enjoying a liberal peace since 1991, to be sure, where everything seemed to be going the way of the West. This needs to be addressed in a way that I think is appropriate given the circumstances of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pradhan. Christina or Diane, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, I just like to jump in quickly and sort of, what Dr. Bodhan said. I think that this, I don't know if it's necessarily who or what nation, if you will, that we should fear next, but we should fear the idealism that sort of is associated by some sects, if you will, of the population, and at this point, the world population. When you sit back and sort of analyze what's been happening, not just in North America, but now in the world, some would say that this is like a nice sort of segue from what's been happening in the United States and the Trumpism, if you will. And then it just sort of morphed into what's happening in Russia and who's supporting whom and who's got ties to whom from when and where. And it just makes me realize that there is a lot of false news that's being spread around about what indeed caused this war in Ukraine. Why did Russia abruptly attack Ukraine? And the hearsay stories, the untruths. I think that's what we have to fear the most. And I know that Dr. Cordan was speaking to that just a moment ago, but we have to fear that there are people who really truly don't believe that Russia is in the wrong in what they're doing. And that to me is the most frightening thing about having yet another war waged upon Ukraine, when people don't fully understand. And try as we might to sort of paint the picture, it's still, to me, misrepresented. And I think that is one of the most fearsome things that's erupting from this most recent conflict in the world.
Yeah, Christina, I would agree with you there too. It's this infiltration of that ideology that all of us are seeing now that's contrary to, in my opinion, what we believe as caring for each other and being good human beings and understanding that we're a part of that whole global family. I watched when Prime Minister Trudeau was addressing the European Union, and there were people that were German people from the very extreme far right that stood up and denounced him and told him he should be ashamed that he's even coming to the European Union and speaking from what had gone on in Ottawa. Same thing with a Croatian representative there. And so that ideology, as you mentioned, what was happening in Washington, D.C., what happened for us in Ottawa, it's like it keeps, you worry about whether it's taking an inch and actually traveling a mile, I think. And that's right. What makes me very afraid too, is that what will we look like in the next, if we're not fighting back at this point globally, nationally, what will we look like and who will we represent? And I find sometimes it's a real dichotomy in the world, even in our own province, where we'll be such caring people that will find the capacity to be able to raise millions of dollars. And I look at something like the tragedy with the Humboldt Broncos and how we wrapped our arms around each other. And then you will get the other dichotomy where, the challenges that went on in North Battleford with the Colton Bushy trial. And I worry about what that ideology, that shift, and you can't even pinpoint it because it shifts itself, right? It's like sand here. And I worry about that throughout the whole world.
Yeah,
I could pick up, if I could just very briefly, Dan's comments. I think you're quite right to sort of be fearful of what this sort of ideological sort of debate and split might morph into, if you will. And it's debilitating, to sort of engage in these kinds of political pairing with thrust and parry with your political opponents. I think the focus always has to be on the suffering, that these are innocents that are being brutalized, and a fundamental injustice is being done here. And if we concentrate on that, if we understand that, then all the other stuff sort of just simply slips away, disappears. There's a lot of, I think, goodwill and compassion around the suffering of children, the suffering of the innocents, those that in effect who understand that what is at issue here is just something much more fundamental, and that is about people in need and who need our assistance. Period. Full stop.
Thank you, everyone, for your responses. I will pass it down to Madhurja for the next question.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to recognize something that the atrocities that are going on in Ukraine is a war crimes going on, genocide going on, and why I specifically mention it is because I am from Bangladesh, and in 1971, when it was getting created from the liberation war, lots of people died, but because how the geopolitical situation was, on which side of the spectrum Bangladesh stood, it wasn't acclaimed as internationally as a war crime. It took many years for USA, a big country, to recognize it. Canada did some good work helping Bangladesh, but 3 million people died, and what's happening in Ukraine is, it just breaks my heart. I have a specific question. After I recognize this fact to Dr. Koran, is I know we talked about the theologies, the ideologies, and the war between the ideologies, but there is a narrative, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is there, is that although innocent people are dying in Ukraine, it is a war between Russia and US, or the West, or the NATO itself, but it's happening in Ukraine. And why I say it is, you see, whenever there is a vote against Russia in the UN, lots of the big countries, economically, geographically, they would abstain from the votes. They wouldn't, because they know that if they vote no, then they're going against Russia. If they vote yes, then they're going for US. And there's this kind of the ploy that's going on. So how do you look at it? And also, I saw that in maybe 2 days ago that more countries like Finland and Sweden, they're trying to join NATO, and Russia has already said that if they join, it might get bigger. So how do you see the whole thing, Dr. Koran?
I'd like to begin by your earlier comments about Bangladesh. As a young lad growing up, I was appalled by what had happened in Nigeria with the Igbo. And even as a young lad, I asked, why isn't the world doing something about this? Mm-hmm. Why isn't this being stopped? And I thought to myself, well, this is an adult matter. So the adults should take care of it. Who am I but a boy? But these images keep haunting me. So that when I saw what was happening in Aleppo, in effect, and I saw that Russians were responsible for this criminal behavior, I also knew that they could repeat this anytime, anywhere, any place. And it has a lot to do with the kind of the moral necessity of having to stop conflict wherever you see it, to put a halt to it. And this requires political will. And so it goes to your succeeding question. I think it's easy to see this as a conflict between superpowers, because I think we're trained to see this in the context of us as only myself, as a person who grew up in the Cold War. This is the nature of international conflict. But let's recognize when Finland and Sweden are now prepared to join NATO after literally decades upon decades of neutrality, you have to ask the question: is this simply sort of geopolitics at work here, or is it something larger and deeper, which is the kind of sort of fear that comes from the kind of unpredictable behavior that arises from imperial, an imperial reach that actually has no parameters. Empires in general do not have parameters because they're based on power. So we can see this constantly repeating itself. So Sweden and Finland are joining not because they're somehow enamored by American hegemony. What it is that they're fearing the future, a future where they may very well become subject to the kind of atrocities that we've seen elsewhere, historically, globally, and so on and so forth. So I don't like to frame it as a geopolitical struggle between hegemons. I think that's a cop-out. And it's rather naive. What we're talking about here, concentrate on what is essential. It's the suffering of people. This needs to stop, and stop now. And the United Nations has to stop it. And it has to, excuse the phrase, but it has to sort of muscle up and do what it's expected to do. And yet it fails to do it. It tells me something about the United Nations. It has to be reimagined as an international organization to do these things, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. Sorry, I'm getting it.
But I agree with Bohdan about the UN implicitly. Instead of a group of people looking very worried and discussing and following their protocol in order to respond to massive situations like this, Ukraine in particular, because it is the most recent, but other tragic events which have occurred not so long ago. Something more needs to be done. And as the youngest of three, I want something more punitive done, against the Russians because I'm that angry with them. Or maybe because I just realized that maybe something more punitive needs to be done against nations or countries like this who just unprovoked attack other countries. The loss of life and the heartbreak that's occurring right now has to be stopped, and there has to be a different way to handle this. And I really appreciate what Bohdan said regarding that.
Yeah, I do too. Bohdan, you put it, it's the suffering of people. And I think for all of us, there hasn't been anything that has been, if I can say it, fair, warfare fair, if I can say it that way. And the suffering of civilians, the lack of restraint for them, putting forward all of their military power to hospitals and to kindergartens and to apartment buildings, it's atrocious. And I think that's probably what all of us say is, where is that line? Like, how much more of this can those poor people in Ukraine possibly take? And how much, the world needs to, like you say, step up to the plate, and enough is enough. And you get all of these, thou shalt not go there. And where is that thou shalt not go there anymore from all of those I'm not sure if that's a Star Wars phrase or not, but or Lord of the Rings, I don't know. But it's like, it has to be that, there needs to be that passion and that belief that this is the end of that. And I think that's what all of us are, that aren't on the in, if I can say it that way, are trying to understand is when will all of those organizations, whether it's the United Nations, the UN, our own country, when will it be enough for you to say, thou shalt not go across this line anymore? And we need it.
And let's recognize that often from a business point of view or supply chain point of view, we try to put economic value on impacts, and we've seen that tremendously. But what the comment that Bohdan makes really resonates with me, because the impact on suffering is priceless. It strikes at the very core of who we are as humans, and it should rally us more strongly than it is right now.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone. Now I will pass it off to Lenore.
Yeah, thanks, Madhuna. I'm really appreciating this round. Just such a thoughtful discussion. I know we could go on, and thanks, Carolyn, for your comment. Great discussion and comments about the atrocious situation faced by Ukraine. I very much appreciate all the panelists and moderators for participating in this session. So good job on us, I guess. Hey, guys. It's important because, as we're saying, right, this impacts everywhere. I want to switch. I'm wearing a green t-shirt, and I'm wearing it for a reason. It's because of a guy named Zelensky. Okay. there is something about this leader that is impressing, I think, the world, even if you don't want to be impressed. It's impressive. I wouldn't mind just in round, and this goes for my colleagues too, just on, what do we need to be thinking about in terms of leadership, and what does Zelensky, as the lead of Ukraine right now, what is he representing to the rest of the world, and maybe what other questions or things do we need to be thinking about with respect to that? And Dr. Cordon, I want to toss it to you first to set the tone for us. You're going to set a high bar for the rest of us, but I know you'll also set some context for us too. So, some considerations here, please.
Yeah, I've heard this comment about Zelensky, and Zelensky, they've often sort of said in a rather cynical way, well, he's an actor, and so all of this is for show and the like. And I thought that this is a rather uncharitable sort of description of a man who really has shown himself to be who he is and a person like that can only be who they are under the most difficult circumstances, and this truly is the most difficult of circumstances. But I think that there's something much more than this, and part of it has to do with him being sort of a comedian, and I'm struck by how attuned he is to the needs of his people. How attuned he is to his contemporaries, his fellow executives who occupy other sort of presidential offices around the globe, and he knows what to say to each audience, if you will. And as he does this round from going from parliament to parliament to parliament, it's not an acting job. What it is for him ultimately is that he is a comedian, as most comedians are attuned to their audience in a way that most of us are not. They're always looking for that sweet spot. They're always looking for that moment where what they say resonates, the comic moment that actually brings out the joy and laughter in all of us. And that is a rare talent for it to be done consistently, if you will. So what he's doing is he's tapping into that thing that most comedians have, which is an ability to look into the other person and simply say, I can connect with you because what I have to say is meaningful, and I believe what you will understand will be meaningful to you. And he does this consistently. This is an exceptional human being. He will be remembered. Somebody had spoken, I think it was Professor Alexander Motier at the Rutgers University, who I follow and I think is just tremendous. But he said that this is, and he's an American academic, but he said that Zelensky is Ukraine's George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I go beyond that. George Washington was the person who showed tremendous leadership skills under difficult circumstances, but this is more. He speaks for people in a way that you rarely see from a politician, and I believe it comes from his comic sense of humanity.
Yeah, and would you?
Sorry, Diane. Go ahead, Diane.
I was going to say, would this be a good way to put it? I almost feel like sometimes it's an oxymoron. Is there such a thing as a funny lawyer? Because he also is a lawyer. But I really believe that what Zelensky represents is he's everything that all of us wish we could be.
Yeah.
I think that's a really big piece. It's, you'll have a 10-year-old child who will see him looking like, Batman and Spider-Man and all of those people. I want to say Captain America, but I didn't want to say that either.
Captain Ukraine.
Captain, what he has become. He has become this legend. And can you be a folk legend in real time? I don't know. But I think that's what it is. He brings out that desire for all of us recognize ourselves in him, to recognize the goodness of what he says, to recognize the strength of who he is, that you will stand up for right, and you will stand up for those downtrodden, and that he is his brother's keeper, and all of those things that those, I don't know, can I call them cliches, but in a good way, all of those things that we believe who we are, and we see the best of ourselves in him. And I think that's such an important piece here that brings the whole world right to where we are right now. And I look at one of my friends is Mike St. Miguel from the Human Rights Commission, and for those of you who follow him on social media, you will have seen maybe a month ago, that his little one is in grade 2, and he wondered why she was very quiet in her room. And he went to her room, and she had this beautiful picture that had the Ukrainian flag and some other things there that she was wanting to say, I know that this is happening. And she had a butterfly right beside it because she knew that there's going to be some goodness out of this. Now, what kind of impact is that?
Yeah. And what we're seeing here in leadership that I really like is this is, to me, an incredible example of being a leader in a 24/7 climate that's impacted by social media. We think back to years ago when somebody was on a world stage and impacted an event. We read about it in the newspaper, we heard about it the next day, or we may have seen a movie clip or something they used to show in the old days in the theaters. I think now we are seeing evidentiary leadership in real time in front of us, and it's giving us hope and confidence.
Yeah.
And it is just such an honor, a pleasure. It's so uplifting to see this man handle things very well. And we've seen so many poor leaders from different nations in the last few years that I think that we're all sort of tainted. And we're all kind of like rubbing our eyes in disbelief. And it's like, is this guy for real? And he really is for real. And it makes me so proud that he's like running things. And I think it's very important just for the morale of Ukrainians, obviously in Ukraine, but worldwide too. So, and I know that we're going to wrap things up here quickly. So I'll just share my favorite meme with you. And it's just where Zelensky is winking at the camera. And it sort of shows that he knows how important this is, but at the same time, it's like, hey, I'm there. But, that's just me in my little world of being a Zelensky fan.
No, I think it's a good point. And, Anika, I want you both to weigh in too, because the leadership is, it's on show right now. It's on display when you see good leadership, when you see excellent leadership, when you see something that goes beyond, you have to be able to, we have to bear witness to this and acknowledge it and be thankful for it. So Anika, over to you, because I know we've had some of these chats.
Yeah, so I'm definitely just seeing him in action. It amazed me that we still have, and you're right, Diana, as you said, he is a hero. Seeing that people like him still exist. He's up front. He's in action. He's not flying away to another country. He's up front. He's standing with his people. He's in it with them. And this amazes me. And this is a good example that he's setting for our future leaders. I'll pass it on to Madhurja.
Oh, you're muted. Oh, shoot.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you. It's so good, it's a mic drop. Yeah, no, we're having
Maybe
some.
we'll get Madhurja to reconnect his audio.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, maybe there are some great comments on our chat. So maybe I'll get Ian to maybe quickly show the comments that Lori, that Carolyn had for our panel members. Perfect. Thanks, Ian, for doing that. So now it's time for our closing remarks. I know we don't want to close the show, but we have to. It's been an incredible discussion. I have learned so much. I'm sure all our listeners, viewers have learned so much from this discussion. I wish we had more time, but we don't. So let's head to the closing remarks. So first of all, thank you again for sharing your wisdom and your responses. We would like to ask each of you to please share any closing reflection and calls to action you may have to share with our audience today. And I will start with Keith Willoughby.
Thank you, Nika. I just say quite succinctly, this is what happens when supply chain meets humanitarian crisis meets impeccable leadership. And we're seeing that, to me, really demonstrated. I think that's going forward. As one of the panelists said, this is what we will be talking about for a long time. Let's also ensure that we are doing the action as well as the talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Over to Christina.
I agree with Keith. It is amazing to see this strong leadership emerging and being sustained, so it stays there. And I'm so proud of when I watch Zelensky, and he keeps his composure and he's level, and but that sense of humor and that appreciation for not just the job that he's doing, but for the people around him is at times overwhelming. And that's what makes me so proud, that he is dealing with this and not running away and not leaving any sort of trail of, the people wondering, is he being a good leader? And that makes me very proud. And I have many other things to say, but if we're going to end with something like this, I'll end with just the admiration I have for Zelensky. If I could just say one other thing, I am going to drop a dime here and mention the May 4th Unite for Ukraine event, which is happening at TCU. I'll be your MC for that event, and it's being organized to raise money for our sister city in Chernivtsi, and that sisterhood sort of dates back to when my father was on city council, and so it dates back many, many years. We've been sort of connected for generations, and I hope that people will attend and help out that way. In the meantime, my thanks to everybody on this panel and the organizers.
Thank you. And over to Diane.
Well, I think, I concur with everything that my fellow panelists have said. And I just wanted to give accolades, I guess, to all of the various organizations and individuals, within Saskatoon and Saskatchewan, the leadership that has been shown here, people picking up the ball and running with an idea and just believing that they can make a difference by buying donuts and Long Johns from Nestor's Bakery, who's raised $20,000 in that capacity. Like, I think all of us should be just loving the love that is out there, and the desperation in some ways to help, but the capacity to love is such an important piece here. Bogdan, it really resonates with me when you speak about the suffering that's going on there, and that people are trying to alleviate that suffering in any way possible. And we should be so grateful that we have the kind of examples that we have for children and people and society in general. But they are actually, there's been a call to arms, if I can say it that way, and everyone has just been stepping up to the plate. So, God is good that he allows us to be able to recognize that we are our brothers and sisters keepers. That's an important piece for me, and I'm so grateful for that.
And over to you, Bogdan.
Sure. The feminist perspective also always talks about, the personal as the political. And I think this is just one more example of how germane and how relevant that viewpoint really is that people matter, and we can make a difference if we understand, what's at issue. And I think the great untold story in Ukraine is the extraordinary effort at mobilization of a nation in its efforts to defend itself. And this will be written in the historical annals of Ukraine, but also European history and even global history. And that being said, I do not want to minimize what we can expect. You've all read the news. It's a major battle that will be shaping up in the east of Ukraine. We're talking about sort of a battle that Europe hasn't witnessed since the Second World War. Heavy armaments, long-range barrel artillery, tanks, drones. The casualties on the battlefield will be tremendous, but it will exact a huge toll on the civilian population. But having said that, I go back to this notion of the people are prepared to defend themselves. The personal is the political. They have no choice in the matter, and we need to do what we can to support that cause. And we see, Diane, as you said, we can even do our bit here in Saskatoon.
Thank you so much. Before I pass it on to Lenore, I will, first of all, thanks to all our viewers. And if you liked our show, feel free to share this so we can spread the word. So we can spread this insightful thoughts from our panelists. So I'll pass it on to Lenore.
Yeah, thank you. There's a comment made by one of our viewers, Carolyn, and I love it. Be like Zelensky.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. I want the T-shirt. So I think we're going to have to do that as a fundraiser, guys. That's an awesome one. So thank you so much for that. Thanks to everybody just for joining us tonight. To my colleagues, Anika, Rashid, who had to leave, but he was here as well. And I just really appreciate his thoughtfulness in this. Majora, always appreciating you, and Ian behind the scenes, and to, of course, all of you as guests, Keith, Diane, Christina, and Bogdan. We've gotten to know each other better today, I think. And I think we've gotten to understand a lot more about the situation that's going on in Ukraine. It's much more than a situation in Ukraine. It's about our world, and it's about how it reflects on us. And in that, we all have a call to action, and that's to reflect our very best out in the world. Let's be like Zelensky.
Slava Ukraini.
There
Yes.
you go. Slava Ukraini. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight. Much appreciation.
And don't forget to like our Facebook pages for more upcoming shows. I had to plug it in there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much. Thanks so much, everyone.